So let's talk more about GDP and what it is that we're dealing with. I think at this point, I'd like to know what it is that you think GDP is. What does GDP mean to you? And I'd like you to have a brief discussion with anyone next to you. And if you'd like to, ask me a question as well. Would you like to tell us? Okay, it's a measure of an economy's strength and performance, which is important when we want to have, like competitions against other countries and be like, haha, we've got more than you. Yeah? Okay?
Is it linked to the standard of living? Like the higher the GDP, the greater the standard of living?
I mean, it is linked, certainly. China is the second biggest economy in the world. A lot of people there have a pretty poor standard of living, though. Unfortunately. So you do have GDP, and then there's another important component, which is GDP per capita, which is where we divide the total number of GDP by the number of people, which is potentially a more informative measure of standard of living. But there's one thing that GDP per capita gives you, which is an average, which means it doesn't tell you what the difference is in terms of inequality. You might have a lot of really rich people and a lot of really poor people, and then on average they look all right. But there's people really in a bad place at the bottom. Anyone else? No? Okay. So let's talk about the definition. GDP is the market value of all, and then there's this word there, final, which is important. Final goods and services produced within a country in a specific time period, usually a year. So we will normally measure GDP over a year, although you could get quarterly GDP figures, you could get monthly GDP figures.
So it's like legal goods, not weed. We don't include weed in some of it.
We don't include weed, although is that a good thing or not? Okay, someone tell me this. Here's the point, right? Anyone know where a lot of heroin gets produced?
Afghanistan.
Oh. So when I want my weed, I know who I'm talking to. Okay, so a lot of it comes from Afghanistan. Afghanistan has a pretty poor GDP, and none of the exports of poppy for the purpose of heroin production gets incorporated in the GDP of Afghanistan. Is that a truthful then measure of what's going on in Afghanistan?
No.
Probably not, because if you are a primary producer of heroin, you've probably got a pretty good GDP figure. Cocaine, as well.
I'll ask you, why don't they include illegal goods?
Why don't they? There's a pretty good reason why they don't. It's because they don't know who's doing it. So they don't know how much of it's being done, and they can't measure it. So like, if we could, and here's a question, if you could, right, measure it, and you knew who was doing it, and it wasn't illegal, what you could then do is tax it. If you tax it, well, think about cigarettes and alcohol, right? They are subject to something called a sin tax, which is to say, I don't actually know anymore, I'm a little bit out of touch on this, but I think it's about 50% of the cost of a package of a cigarette. I think now is taxes, thereabouts. Certainly alcohol is pretty close to that now. So most of what, well not most, but a good chunk of what you're paying when you're buying those things goes to the government. So imagine a cocaine trade of a couple of billion a year, 50% of that goes to tax. That seems like a pretty good tax boost. Or the alternative is to spend billions of rands a year trying to catch drug dealers. And when you catch them and put them in prison, someone else just takes over. And then you spend some more money and you put them in prison. Or if you are Pablo Escobar, you get the government, after they've arrested you, you agree to build a prison for yourself in which you live, which is guarded by the government, right? So you have a security force paid for by the government making sure you never leave your prison, which you built. And conduct business from. Yeah, it's a pretty good way to do that, sorry. Yeah?
Wouldn't like an even bigger potential loss of income, like will that logic come from informal trade though?
Definitely, yeah. By the same logic, if you've got a bunch of informal traders and you don't know what they're doing, how do you capture that in GDP? You don't. So if you walk to Wits today and there's the guy on the side of the road selling the chappies and stuff, you know, none of that trade is captured in GDP. But then also maybe something that you haven't yet kind of thought about is people working at home. You fix your garage door, you don't pay someone to do it, you fix it yourself. That doesn't get captured in GDP. You pay someone to do it, and that gets captured in GDP. Right? If you are someone working at home, cooking yourself a meal, I mean not working at home, but like looking after a home, cooking meals, cleaning up, things like that, it doesn't go into GDP. It's stuff that's happening, it's like economic activity happening, but it doesn't get captured in GDP. So definitely GDP it's got limitations, right? It doesn't capture all the kind of economic activity that's going on in the country. One more point though on the drugs thing. Portugal, I don't want to get my facts wrong, but I don't know if it's the whole of Portugal or somewhere in Portugal, but I think it's the whole of Portugal, legalized, when I say legalized, and I can't remember how far this extends, but I think it's marijuana, cocaine, and heroin at least. I don't know what else. It might be all drugs. They're all legal, which is to say you can take them, right, and you don't get prosecuted for taking them, which means you can have a certain amount on you and it's not illegal. I don't think you're allowed to sell it, right? So you can have drugs on you, you can take them, and it's legal. And that they did 10 years ago. Sorry?
Who sells them?
Well, drug dealers. Yeah. So the big problem in Portugal back in the day, 10 years ago, was, oh my goodness, you're going to do this and drug use is going to go out of control. What has happened is drug use, the official figures on drug use, because previously, you know, it's difficult to tell if someone's using drugs if they don't come forward to say, I'm using drugs, because it's illegal, right? So you kind of get an idea of what you think the drug market is like, right? After you make it legal, a lot of people come forward and say, listen, I've got a problem, I've got an addiction. So a lot of people came forward and started getting involved in programs to try and help them deal with the drug stuff. And you could buy, in fact, if you go forward and you have an addiction, you can buy it legally from like a chemist or something. There's some official channel by which you can get your fix. And what they found was that that did not grow the drug market. There wasn't an increase in expected sales of drugs, the estimated sales of drugs. It didn't increase the market, and a lot of people, there were a lot less deaths because of drugs, and there were a lot less crime because of drugs. Because a lot of people were able to come forward and say, look, I've got a problem. Which is just an interesting way of dealing with a drug problem. Throw the cops at it, or, you know, throw social workers. And it seems that social workers kind of work quite well. So again, another thing that's not in this GDP measure is any second-hand goods. So why is it important? Well, it's some way of assessing our economic performance, but you can't measure, you can't manage what you can't measure, which is the discussion we could have. So we've kind of mentioned before that if we're going to talk about GDP, there's going to be two ways of measuring it. We can either look at what people are earning, or we can look at what they're spending. Somehow these two things have to match up for our economy to work properly. So if we use the expenditure approach, then what we measure GDP by is by consumption, investment, government spending, exports, and imports. And you'll see that imports has a little minus sign in front of it. So we just take everything that we made locally. So we look at everything that was sold. And we look at everything that was bought locally, and we look at what was bought internationally, and we take what was bought internationally. In other words, we bought from somewhere else, and we take that out of the total of everything that was bought. Right? So those first four say everything that was bought in our country, right? Let's add that all up, and then we just need to take out the stuff that was bought from somewhere else in the world, and then that's GDP from our country, right? Within our borders, should we say. So consumption is household spending on goods and services. Investment is purchases of machines and equipment, factories, inventory, and just as a side note, there's no adjustment for depreciation. Then when we look at government spending, we don't take into account social transfers, which is to say, let's say the government this year spent 100 million rand, and of that 100 million rand, 20 million rand of that was given to social services, in other words, given out as benefits, right? We don't then say the government spending was 100 million, we say government spending was only 80 million. 100 million minus 20, 80 million, right? So it's government spending on goods and services. So if they're giving money out to people, they are not buying. What was that? A what? Yeah. These are really poor ringtones. One. Who was that? Oh no. Wear it. I want to know. Yeah, good. Don't. Oh no. Okay. So transfers are not included in government spending. And then obviously if we're talking about what is produced locally, and we got to take out what was imported, otherwise we have a bias or an inaccurate measure. If we look at it from the consumption side of things, then we say the GDP is made up of wages. In other words, this is where money goes in terms of a payment, right? So we looked at expenditure, which was a payment for something. Now we're looking at money, which is a payment, the other side of that equation. You following me? Yeah? Okay. So where does that money go to? It goes to wages, goes to rents, goes to interest, and it goes to profit. What we also then need to do, however, that if we want to know our GDP, and we look at this is what people's income is, we've got to add back to that taxes that were taken away from them, right? So in other words, if you earned a wage and they got paid into your bank account, that's after tax. So you've got to add back that tax, right? But we also have to take into account that a company that earns profits might get paid a subsidy by government. If they get paid a subsidy by government, then we need to take that out of their profits, because that's not an earner. That isn't money that they earned. That's just money that they got given by government. So in the same way that we took government, that we took the social transfers out of the government spending figure, we need to take the subsidies out of the profits figure for firm. Also, if we've got profits for a firm, profit will always be after taking into account depreciation, which means we need to add back depreciation and then subtract this thing called net foreign factor income. Sorry, a question, and we'll come back to that. Yeah?
Just to like on the profit.
Yes.
Is it accounting profit or no?
No, that'll be accounting profits, not economic profits. So, in other words, that profit there is, at the end of the day, the firm has some money which constitutes profit. That is measured in accounting terms, so it must be accounting profit, not magical economic profit. Yeah?
How do they actually get those figures? Like especially for rent, like
Yes.
I mean, as a landlord, you're not obliged to like disclose how much you're charging that person. Like I mean.
No, but you are obliged by law to disclose that to the government, and if you don't, then you are in trouble if they ever catch you. So any income that you earn, you are supposed to, by law, tell the government that you earned that income, so that they can go, cool, give me a piece of it. Which is why, if you understand that people respond to incentives, why people kind of don't want to tell the government when they've earned something. Because they're like, no, I don't want to give you something. So. Anyway, and so you have something called tax evasion. So rents here, obviously, the rent that you're referring to is more like household rent. But this is rent for capital in a production process. So this would be someone has made a factory, or someone has built a or like Old Mutual owns a shopping centre, and then people rent shopping space. That would be rents in terms of the production process. Or if you had a factory, again, and in your factory, say you've, well, let's say you don't own the factory, you're borrowing the factory from someone, you're leasing the factory, which obviously a lot of people do, then that rent is part of that. Yeah.
So if I'm renting my bedroom, does that count?
How does rent, so it's, yeah. It's actually quite a tricky one. If you go, you get the read, there's the reading that you got, and there's the textbook, right? And the reading deals a lot with, the reading is the only thing that deals with this side, which is the income approach to measuring GDP. The textbook doesn't deal with it, only reading 1 deals with this. But the textbook does talk about rent and housing and how housing features and comes into this. In other words, when you purchase a new house, it falls under not household consumption, if I recall. I'm pretty sure it falls under investment when you purchase a new house. Then what happens is there's something called imputed income, which we'll deal with right at the end, where there's kind of an estimate of how much it's actually costing you to live in that house as a rental number, even though you are not renting it because it's your house. Right? It's like, how much are you implicitly paying yourself to rent the house from yourself? Right? But you don't get taxed on that, thank you. But yeah. Maybe we will one day, I don't know. And then subtract net foreign factor income just says the following. When you take into account all these numbers here, what happens is some of this stuff, in fact, sorry, this subtracts net factor income, yeah. Some of that money is getting paid to foreigners and some of it's getting paid to locals, right? So what we need to do is subtract the stuff that's actually not staying in the country. Take that out. Whether it's a wage or whether it's a profit or whether it's anything else, take it out. Yeah?
Is that the kind of stuff you then include in gross national income?
Yeah, so what happens then is from our GDP, we can then get different measures of economic activity within our, what can we call it, domain. In other words, GDP is gross domestic product, which is defined as within a specific boundary, right? South African boundary. But we can also measure, well, what did South African citizens earn? Then we'd have to say, well, some of that GDP in our country was earned by people who are not South Africans, and some South Africans earn money outside of South Africa. Then what we've got to do is we've got to say, if we want to know how much did South Africans earn, we've got to add those people in, and we've got to subtract the foreign people out, right? So then you might have something like gross national income, GNI, which is then different to GDP. And you can take GDP, add some things, subtract some things, and then you get GNI, gross national income. That's all in reading 1. You can read it. It's incredibly boring for me to talk about it. So, I'm just going to let you read that. You can go, okay, this plus this minus this equals this. This minus that plus this, whatever. And then we'll get some questions, some MCQ questions that deal with that. When we do those MCQ questions, then we can talk more about maybe what's confusing about these things. Because it can get quite confusing. But just as a summary then, here's a table. GDP in terms of the expenditure approach, GDP in terms of the income approach. Okay? So take a look at that at some point, memorize it. You will get an MCQ on it at some point. Here's a video on it. Probably will do a better job of it than I will. Yes, Nick. That's right, they should equal each other. Because you're measuring the same thing, GDP. So whether we measure it by expenditure or income, it should give us the same number. In other words, this number here whether it's the expenditure approach or the income approach, is the same number. Very astute observation. Okay, so we've spoken about some shortcomings, but before we get there, this real GDP versus nominal GDP. This is an important distinction, and it's the kind of thing that people wouldn't really think about, I suppose, in an everyday kind of situation. But it's going to matter for what we're dealing with. When we deal with GDP, we are generally talking about something called real GDP. What do we mean by real GDP? Well, what we say is the following. What would the value of goods and services produced this year be if we valued those goods and services at the prices that prevailed in some other year? Okay? In other words, if my GDP this year was 100 and my GDP next year was 200, right? But prices doubled in that period. Am I producing more or not? By a very quick calculation, you can be like, okay, if GDP was 100 in the first year, and prices doubled between the first and the second year, and the value of GDP doubled, then the value of what we actually produced has stayed the same. The only reason it looks like there's more is because prices have changed, right? So what we want to know is growth in GDP. We want to know, are we producing more? So if we're looking at the number 100 and the number 200, it looks like we're producing more, but we're not. It's just that there's a price thing that's happened, right? It's like someone's trying to pull the wool over our eyes. So what we would want to say then is, in that second year when things cost 200, if we valued them at the same prices as the things from the first year, what number would we get? And in our example, if they cost 100 in the first year, what would they cost in the second year if we used the same prices as the first year? 100 as well. Is everyone with me on that? Yeah? That is measuring real GDP. If we just look at the number 100 and the number 200, then we're dealing with something called nominal GDP, which is just the value of goods produced in that year at those prices. So what we need to do is we need to choose something called a base year, and that doesn't actually look very good with these colors. A base year, and a base year just says, well, what year are we going to compare everything to? Okay? And then we're going to take the prices from that year. So when GDP based on the prices that prevailed when output was produced versus GDP that has been deflated or inflated to reflect changes in the price level. Okay? In other words, GDP based on prices that prevailed when the output was produced is called nominal GDP. GDP that has been adjusted for changes in prices is called real GDP. You got me? GDP at current prices versus GDP at constant prices. GDP at current prices is, which one is that? Nominal. GDP at constant prices, real. Okay, it's an important distinction. You probably have no idea why it would mean anything right now, and that's fine, we'll get to it. So what are the problems with GDP? We spoke about it. There's a whole bunch of things that it doesn't capture, a whole bunch of economic activity that it doesn't capture. But apart from that, there's also things that we haven't even thought about, which is like people value having time to spend with their significant other, watching a movie. Just having leisure, in other words. We don't measure that with GDP. So it doesn't tell us anything about our economy. I'm just going to take a question, then I'll take a question. The improved product quality as well. In other words, if I buy a TV this year, that TV is infinitely better than a TV in the 1960s. Right? But GDP doesn't tell us anything about that. So you can see it's GDP, it's a measure, but it's definitely not a good measure. Yeah?
You spoke about a base year, so
yes.
Is there a criteria of choosing a base year or something?
No, absolutely none. You just choose a base year. Literally. And the base year changes. So what will happen is like you get the Reserve Bank or Stats SA, let's say they release figures, right? And it's for 5 years, from 2011 to 2016. And they go, cool, 2011 is the base year. So compare everything to 2011. You got it.
How is usually time spent with your beloved one considered economic activity?
It's not considered economic activity, but
isn't it like rightfully excluded?
certainly in terms of the idea of producing a product that is tangible. But if you are consuming leisure, you are consuming something. It's not tangible, but you are deriving something out of it, right? If you're deriving something out of it, is that not some indication of activity that is happening? In other words, it is definitely a good question. Yes. I would argue, though, that economic is leisure. But I take your point, yeah. Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, when you do get into the idea of an opportunity cost and understanding what it is that you're giving up, if you're giving up leisure, right, you are definitely giving something up, even though it's intangible. And even though it might not be something that you are producing, like, physically, maybe you are producing leisure physically. I don't know. Anyway, that's what I say. Yes. No, exactly. No, it's a good point. You're spending your time doing something. In this case, it's leisure. Should that be considered economic activity? I think so, but maybe not.